Hello, and welcome to the National Park Service and the Federal Aviation Administration's public meeting for the draft air tour management plan and environmental assessment at Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. My name is Michelle Carter. I am an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'll be serving as your moderator this evening. I'm going to start off here with defining a couple of acronyms you'll hear us use throughout the meeting. You'll hear us refer to the National Park Service as the NPS, the Federal Aviation Administration as the FAA, the Air Tour Management Plans as ATMPs, and the Environmental Assessment as the EA. We'll define the remaining acronyms as we go along. Next slide, please. We're holding this virtual public meeting to review the draft ATMP for Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park and to take public questions on the draft and the EA. This meeting is being held pursuant to the National Parks Air Tour Management Act of 2000, also known as NAPATMA, and its implementing regulations. You're going to hear a little bit more about NAPATMA and the draft ATMP shortly, along with information on how to submit questions and official comments. But before we dive into the presentations, I'm going to take a minute and introduce our presenters and provide you with information about the meeting logistics and how you can participate. I also want to note that during this public meeting, we're asking that all participants adhere to professional standards of conduct. We reserve the right to remove any disruptive participants or anyone who uses discriminatory language, personal insults, or obscenity. Next slide, please. So joining us this evening as presenters, and I'll have you come on camera, we first have Eric Elmore, a senior policy advisor with the Office of Environment and Energy at FAA. We have Vicki Ward, Overflights Program Manager from the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division of the National Park Service. From the park, we have Rhonda Lowe, the Park Superintendent, and we also have Danielle Foster, the Park's Environmental Protection Specialist. We'll have Eric and Vicki provide a brief overview of NAPATMA and the purpose of today's meeting. And then we'll hear from Superintendent Lowe and Danielle, who will share information from the park's perspective and discuss the park-specific resources and the draft ATMP. Next slide, please. Throughout the meeting, we invite you to submit your questions, which will be addressed at the end after the presentations as part of the Q&A or the question and answer session. We're going to be taking the questions via a Google form, and you can access that either by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking on the link that our meeting host is dropping into the chat there. Questions submitted through tonight's meeting will be considered by the agencies in the development of the draft ATMP, but they won't be considered formal comments. Next slide, please. All of the official comments must be submitted through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment, or PEPC website, or they can be sent to the mailing address that's also listed on the park's PEPC site. Only comments received one of those two ways will become a part of the official record, and the comments must be submitted on or before June 20th at 8 p.m. Hawaii time. The reason for the 8 p.m. Hawaii time is because the servers are based in Denver and everything closes down at midnight Mountain Time. Therefore, we wanted to make sure that everybody knew it was 8 p.m. Hawaii time on the 20th. The agencies are not accepting official comments via email, and I'll share a little bit more information about this later in the presentation. Next slide, please. So while I mentioned this meeting is taking place on Zoom, we're actually accepting the questions through the use of the Google form. I'm going to ask a couple of times throughout the meeting for our host to drop the link into the chat. If people join after the meeting started, they might not have access to previous links that had been shared. So if you can please submit your questions using this link, it would be appreciated, and it'll help us also manage the Q&A at the end. It will allow us hopefully to group similar questions if they come in. So when the time comes, we're going to read the questions aloud, and our presenters will do their best to respond. Depending on how many questions we get, we are going to try to get to all of them, but in the event, we will also wanted to know, in the event that there's a delay with any of the questions coming in, there's a possibility that we might review some of the frequently asked questions that you'll find on the website. I can share more information about that later. We might also end up reviewing some questions that we've received during some of the other recent public meetings if there's information that's relevant for Hawaii volcanoes. So overall, the meeting will be 90 minutes long. We will adjourn right around 7:30 Hawaii time. And if we get to a place during the Q&A session, if we've gotten through all of the questions early, we're planning to still keep the meeting active until about 7:30, just in case additional questions come in. And please note, I think you saw the notice when you joined, but the meeting is being recorded. We appreciate you joining us this evening to learn more about the draft ATMP. We'll now play a short video before we turn it over to Eric and Vicki to provide additional details about NAPATMA and why we're here today.
The United States is home to some of the most breathtaking national parks and tribal lands in the world. It is important that we protect these lands while ensuring that the public has ample opportunity to enjoy these national treasures. Air tours offer the public a totally different type of experience. The Federal Aviation Administration and the National Park Service work together to manage air tours over national parks. We are developing plans that help protect wildlife, wilderness character, cultural resources, natural soundscapes, and visitor enjoyment. These plans are known as Air Tour Management Plans, and today we will explore the specifics of the draft plan for your park. As part of our planning process, we consult with tribes, Native Hawaiian organizations, state and tribal historic preservation officers, and wildlife biologists. We assess noise, wildlife protection, and other environmental considerations, and we will continue to make adjustments to these plans as needed. And we consider the appropriate level of National Environmental Policy Act review for these plans. The FAA and the National Park Service are committed to ensuring safe flights at our national parks while safeguarding park resources. Following today's presentation, we encourage you to review your park's draft Air Tour Management Plan and provide official comments through the National Park Service Planning, Environment, and Public Comment website. Together, we can celebrate these special places and ensure they can be enjoyed for generations to come.
Thanks, Michelle, and welcome everybody. My name is Eric Elmore. I am a senior policy advisor with the Federal Aviation Administration's Office of Environment and Energy, and I'm going to provide a brief overview of the National Parks Air Tour Management Act, also known as NAPATMA. Next slide, please. So NAPATMA requires the Federal Aviation in cooperation with the National Park Service to develop an air tour management plan called an ATMP for those parks where operators have applied to conduct commercial air tours. NAPATMA was enacted back in 2000, and at that time, commercial air tour operations were already occurring. And so commercial air tour operators were required to apply to FAA for what is known as Interim Operating Authority, or IOA, in order to continue operating back in 2000. And so those parks where IOA was issued is where the parks where the agencies are required to develop air tour management plans or voluntary agreements. An air tour management plan applies only to commercial air tours, and it only applies to commercial air tour operations that occur within a half a mile of a park outside of that park boundary, as well as in the airspace that is up to 5,000 feet above ground level, also referred to as 5,000 feet AGL. And again, the PATMA does not apply to non-commercial air tour operations such as general aviation, commercial airline operations, military flights, etc. So next slide, please. Now, the objectives of the air tour management plans are to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent the significant adverse impacts, if any, of commercial air tour operations on the park's natural and cultural landscapes, resources, on Native Hawaiian traditional cultural properties, including Native Hawaiian sacred sites and ceremonial areas, wilderness character, or the visitor experience. Next slide, please. Now, in order to kind of meet that objective from the previous slide, an air tour management plan may prohibit commercial air tour operations either in whole or in part. An air tour management plan may establish conditions for the conduct of air tour operations, including things such as routes, altitudes, time of day restrictions, restrictions for particular events, maximum number of flights, etc. Again, air tour management plans have to apply to all commercial air tour operations that again occur within that half mile outside of the park boundary and within that airspace. Air tour management plans are required to include incentives for the adoption of quiet aircraft technology. They are also required to provide for the initial allocation of opportunities to conduct air tours when the air tour management plan limits the number of operations, and that is the case at this park. And finally, the air tour management plan shall justify and document the need for the measures taken pursuant to the above and include such justifications in the record of decision. And at this point, I believe I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Vicki Ward from the National Park Service to give you a little more information.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And good evening, everyone. I'm Vicki Ward. I'm the Overflights Program Manager in the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division in the National Park Service. And so with this slide, if you're on a phone or some other small screen, I'll just give you a brief description of this one. This is a map of the United States with an inset showing the Hawaiian Islands. And this just is illustrating 3 parks we are already have completed air tour management plans for, or that we are currently working on. Most of the air tour parks are in the Western US. We have, a cluster in the Utah area, some out in California, a couple in Washington State. And then obviously we are here tonight about Hawaiʻi volcanoes, and we had the public meeting for the Haleakala ATMP a couple weeks ago. Regardless, we are covering quite a bit of the US with these air tour management plans being developed. And with that, go to the next slide, please. So on our air tour management plans that we're currently working on, we have 9 underway right now. We're working on, we have 4 air tour management plans out for public review right now. That's Haleakala, Hawaiʻi Volcanoes, which is what we're going over tonight, Badlands, and Mount Rushmore. Those are all open for public comment until June 20th, and so we welcome any comments on any and all of those. But we've already completed air tour management plans for 13 parks. We've done 10 plans to address all those parks. And we recently, earlier this year, we completed voluntary agreements for the Statue of Liberty and Governor's Island in New York. And so we are, like I said, we were continuing to work on these air tour management plans, and we'll have some more out for public review later this year. Go to the next slide, please. And so with each air tour management plan, NEPATMA requires that we publish that proposed air tour management plan in the Federal Register to notify the public it's available. We hold at least one public meeting because we want to get input from the public on the development of that draft plan. And we are also complying with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, and other legal requirements, which Eric will go over in just a couple minutes. And the purpose of today's meeting, again, is to review the components of the draft air tour management plan for Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. And with that, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Rhonda Lowe.
Aloha kako. My name is Rhonda Lowe, Superintendent at Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. First, I want to Valina Mai, or welcome and mahalo each of you for taking the time to join us tonight. I also want to thank Vicki and Eric for their detailed overview of the air tour management planning process, and to Michelle for moderating this session. As described previously, the purpose of today's meeting is to hear directly from you and to respond to your questions on this draft air tour management plan. Your input is very important to us. For those of you unfamiliar with the park, I'll provide a quick overview. Next slide. Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park is on the southern end of the island of Hawaii, located in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The park includes two of the most active volcanoes on Earth, Kilauea and Mauna Loa. Mauna Loa is the most massive active volcano on Earth, rising more than 30,000 feet from the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. Established in 1916, Hawaiʻi Volcanoes is the 15th national park in the system that now encompasses 423 areas. The purpose of this park is to protect, study, and provide access to Kilauea and Mauna Loa and perpetuate endemic Hawaiian species and ecosystems and the traditional Hawaiian culture connected to these landscapes. Within the 354,461 acres of the park, 123,100 acres are legislated as wilderness. An additional 128,865 acres have been identified as eligible or potential wilderness. Altogether, that's about 71% of the park. Between 1 to 2 million visitors from around the world, near and far, visit us annually to witness firsthand the volcanic processes that create new land. Next slide. This map shows the boundary of the park in red and the area of the ATMP, which extends a half mile beyond the park boundary, and that's actually the red line. So you see it's about half mile around, just beyond the park boundary. Shown, I don't have a pointer, but shown here is Mauna Loa and Kilauea. And the summit of Kilauea is where the most recent lava activity just started erupting again this morning, has been, and is where the majority of park visitation occurs. Wilderness, designated potential and eligible areas are blocked out in green hatch lines. Next slide. In addition to volcanic processes, the park is world-renowned for the diversity of habitats that extend from sea level to the summit of Mauna Loa These range from the dry coastal strand vegetation to dense tropical rainforest and subalpine shrublands, to name a few. Together, these areas provide a refuge for hundreds of endemic native plants and animal species that are unique to the islands. In other words, found nowhere else in the world. And it includes dozens of federally listed endangered and threatened plants and wildlife species. Next slide. Importantly, the park commemorates and acknowledges the human connection to the land, both past and present. And this is found throughout the park. This is evident through the rich archaeological record of the Kanaka Maoli, or Native Hawaiians, the cultural landscapes, and with today's cultural practitioners who continue to cherish the sacred landscape for which Kilauea is home to their goddess Pele. In recognition of its unique qualities, the park was designated both a World Heritage Site and an International Biosphere Reserve. Today, visitors from near and far and from around the world come to the park to be inspired, to seek renewal through immersing themselves in this stunning natural environment and rich cultural heritage. Next up is our park planner, Danielle Foster, who will describe our existing conditions for commercial air tours and what is being proposed in the draft ATMP. I look forward to your feedback and encourage you to stay engaged.
Thank you, Rhonda. That was a great overview of the park. Tonight, I will be discussing the existing air tour conditions and the draft air tour management plan, preferred alternative, and its elements. Currently, there are 10 commercial operators that hold interim operating authority, which is IOA for short, so you'll hear me say IOA a lot, for a combined total of 26,664 flights per year over the park. This is the maximum number of flights that could currently be flown. To reflect current conditions, the National Park Service and the FAA used the 3-year average of actual flights as reported by operators using the years of 2017 to 2019. The average comes to 11,376 total flights conducted by the 10 operators each year. The annual number of commercial air tours at the park is currently limited by the IOA. In addition, at this time, there are no designated parameters on routes, time of day, or day of week, and there are no procedures to establish no-fly periods. Next slide, please. The reason we are here this evening is to describe the draft ATMP for Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. The table you are looking at describes each attribute in the first column, and the second column describes the current conditions, and the third column is what is proposed for each attribute under the draft air tour management plan preferred alternative. I will now walk you through this table. The current condition for the number of air tours authorized per year is calculated using the 3-year average that I discussed before from 2017 to 2019, which is 11,376 flights per year. As described on the earlier slide, the interim operating authority is a total of 26,664 flights per year over the park, which is the maximum number of flights that could be flown under current condition. The agency's preferred alternative, alternative 3, would authorize 1,565 commercial air tours per year within the ATMP planning area. Thus, it would authorize 14% of the existing number of flights based on the 3-year average from 2017 to 2019. In terms of routes and altitudes, under the current condition, there are no mandatory routes or no-fly zones and no requirements on altitudes other than what is required by law. For the draft ATMP, there will be 3 designated routes for the operators authorized under the ATMP. I will go into further detail about the routes on the next slide. With regards to the time of day and day of week restrictions, under the current condition, there are no restrictions on what time of day or day of week flights can occur. Under the draft ATMP, flights would be permitted on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. However, if it is a quiet technology flight, then an operator could fly on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday between the hours of 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Sundays are a no-fly day for all air tour operations within the ATMP planning area. Only quiet technology flights are allowed on Wednesdays under the draft ATMP. Currently, there are no restrictions for special events, but under the draft ATMP, the National Park Service can establish temporary no-fly periods that apply to commercial air tours for special events or planned park management. This would be a mandatory 5-mile standoff distance for an event with 2 months advance notice provided to the operators in writing. This would be limited to the ATMP planning area. Special events could include Native Hawaiian events or other natural and cultural resource programs. And last on the table is training, education, and meetings, which you can see is not currently required under a current condition. Under the draft ATMP, when it is made available by park staff, operators and pilots will take at least one training course per year conducted by the National Park Service. The training will include park information that operators can use to further their own understanding of park priorities and management objectives, as well as enhance the interpretive narrative for air tour clients and increase the understanding of the park by air tour clients. In addition, helicopter pilots must complete the FAA Introduction to Fly Neighborly training within 180 days of the effective date of the ATMP. In terms of meetings, under the draft ATMP, the park staff, the local FAA Flight Standards District Office, also known as FSDO, and all operators will meet once per year to discuss the implementation of the ATMP and any amendments or other changes to the ATMP. Next slide, please. On this slide is a map showing the proposed routes for the draft ATMP. The park is indicated with a darker green color, and the ATMP planning area has the red outlined, as you saw also on Rhonda's slide. And this includes the park and the half-mile buffer around the park. We will start on the east or right side of the map and work our way west with the routes. For the draft ATMP, there will be 3 designated routes for the operators authorized under the ATMP. These include the Pu'u'o'o route in purple, which consists of a route on the east rift of Kilauea in the Pu'u'o'o area with a single entry and exit over the ocean. This allows expansive views of volcanic landscapes from eruptions occurring between 1983 and 2018. In addition, operators that have converted to quiet technology aircraft may request to be allowed to conduct air tours using quiet technology aircraft in an expanded fly zone directly west of this route near Pu'u'o'o. As you can see on the map, it is the lighter green shaded area to the left of the purple route, called the Pu'u'o'o QT zone. The Pu'u'o'o QT zone avoids the designated wilderness boundary near Nepau Crater. Commercial air tours conducted on the Pu'u'o'o route and in the Pu'u'o'o QT zone must maintain a minimum altitude of 1,500 feet above ground level over land and 2,000 feet above sea level. I almost said ground level, but it's really over water. So above mean sea level. Hovering, loitering, and or circling for up to 5 minutes is allowed on the Pu'u'o'o route and in the Pu'u'o'o QT zone. Along the bottom of the park, you can see the coastal route in blue, and it runs bi-directionally offshore along the edge of the park boundary, but within the air tour management planning area. Air tours on the coastal route must maintain 2,000 feet lateral distance from the shore and a minimum altitude of 2,000 feet above sea. The coastal route is available only for use if commercial air tour operators can safely adhere to the required altitude and distance from shore. This route provides expansive views of the Pali, also known as cliffs, and coastal areas. The route would protect wilderness areas, backcountry campgrounds, cultural and sensitive resources within the park. And finally, the Kahuku route runs bi-directionally across the south side of the Mauka Kahuku unit, following Highway 11. Air tours on Kahuku route must maintain a minimum altitude of 1,500 feet above ground level. This route would provide access for Kailua Kona flights and Circle Island tours to provide expansive views of Mauna Loa and from the summit to the sea and past volcanic activity while protecting endangered birds found at higher elevation and eligible wilderness in Upper Kahuku. If pilots are on or entering a route and encounter weather that does not allow them to proceed further along the route at the prescribed altitude, they must safely exit the route and either follow another route or where weather conditions allow, or exit the ATMP boundary under the draft ATMP. Operators may not deviate from designated routes and altitudes except as necessary for safe operation of an aircraft as determined under federal aviation regulations, requiring the pilot in command to take action to ensure the safe operation of the aircraft. And just a reminder that the ATMP planning area is the park boundary plus a half-mile buffer and goes up to 5,000 feet above ground level. This is depicted in the box on the bottom right of the screen, with the brown area depicting land and the blue depicting above ground level area up to 5,000 feet. Next slide, please. The draft ATMP and EA include detailed information on the justifications for the measures that have been included in the draft documents. I will discuss a few of these briefly. Annual flight limits are intended to protect cultural resources, reduce impacts on biological resources, improve visitor experience, and protect wilderness character. The minimum required altitudes of 1,500 feet above ground level over land and 2,000 feet above ground level over the ocean were developed to protect land and marine species and their critical habitats and reduce impacts to visitor experience. Day of week and time of day restrictions would reduce noise and visual impacts to the park's cultural resources and protect Native Hawaiian traditional practices. Reducing the intensity of air tour noise to park visitors would improve wilderness character and visitor experience. Operator training, education, and annual meeting and semi-annual reporting facilitate effective implementation of the ATMP. And I'm now going to pass it back to Eric Elmore with the FAA to talk about National Environmental Policy Act. Thank you.
Thanks, Danielle, and thanks Superintendent Lowe for that. Appreciate it. So now at this time, I'll provide a little bit of information regarding the National Environmental Policy Act, also known as NEPA. The implementation of a final Air Tour Management Act is a federal action that triggers NEPA and its requirements. And so NEPA requires the agency to do a few things. First of all, NEPA requires the agencies consider the human and natural environment that could be affected by the action. And in this case, the action would be the Air Tour Management Plan. Next, the Act NEPA requires the agencies to determine the appropriate level of review. And then finally, NEPA also requires the agencies to prepare the associated environmental review documents. So in regards to this Air Tour Management Plan, the agencies considered over 1,400 public scoping comments that period occurred February 28th through April 1st of last year, and that helped us develop the potential alternatives. The agencies also considered information obtained during consultation processes that we'll talk a little bit more about on the next few slides. The agencies assessed the environmental impacts of the Air Tour Management Plan and its alternatives, and that is in the draft environmental assessment that is currently available for public review and comment. So please, we welcome your input. Next slide, please. In addition to NEPA, the Air Tour Management Plan is considered an undertaking under the National Historic Preservation Act. And under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, the agencies are required to consult. And the 106 consultation process is basically a 4-step process. At first, the agencies are required to define the undertaking and to identify who the consulting parties are. The next step, the agencies are required to determine the area of potential effects, also called the APE, and identify any historic properties that are within that area. Next, the agencies are required to assess the effects to the historic properties of the undertaking. And then finally, the agencies are required to resolve adverse effects, if any, of the undertaking on those historic properties. So at this point, the FAA and Park Service have consulted with the State Historic Preservation Division, called SHPD for short. We've also consulted with Native Hawaiian organizations and individuals and other consulting parties, including operators. The agencies have considered 25 comments during the scoping process and the development of the alternatives regarding potential impacts to cultural resources. And at this point in time, we have proposed a finding of no adverse effects to historic properties as a result of the undertaking, and a letter was sent to the SHPD and to all consulting parties. So that's kind of 106. I'm going to hand it over to Michelle Carter, my colleague, to provide us a little information on endangered species. So.
All right, thanks, Eric. So the FAA and the National Park Service are complying with Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, or ESA, as they develop the draft ATMP. This is to ensure that the proposed action does not jeopardize the existence of any species listed under ESA or result in destruction or adverse modification of any designated critical habitat. The agencies have had informal consultation conversations with both the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service, and the preliminary assessment by the agencies is not anticipating these types of impacts. You'll see here on this slide several species that were included in the consultation conversations. And if you'd like more information about the assessment or any of the species that were considered, you can refer to the documents that are posted on the park's website with the draft ATMP NEA. Next slide, please. So as noted earlier, we're currently inviting comments from the public, from the Native Hawaiian organizations, other agencies, and all interested parties on the draft ATMP and the EA, and comments must be received by June 20th. Comments can be submitted the one of two ways that we discussed, either online through the NPS public comment website, and you'll see that link here on the slide, or you can send it by mail to the address also listed here on the screen. If you don't end up jotting this address down and your preferred way of submitting comments is via mail, you can also go to the website and that address will be there for you. The agencies are not accepting comments via email. I also wanted to let you know that there is a frequently asked questions document that is posted on the park's public comment website that we've been referring to alongside the draft ATMP. And if one of our hosts could drop links to this in the Zoom chat, again, it would be appreciated. All right, next slide, please. So following the end of this public comment period, the FAA and the NPS will review all of the comments that are submitted and consider them as they develop the final ATMP. They'll continue to coordinate and complete consultation under the National Historic Preservation Act, the Endangered Species Act, and continue conversations with the Native Hawaiian organizations. And they'll conclude the NEPA process by signing a decision document. Once all of this is wrapped up, the ATMP will be considered complete, and it will be available for public viewing on both the FAA and the NPS websites. FAA will then update the operations specifications or op specs for each of the air tour operators. Next slide, please. Okay. So with that, I would like to say thank you to all of our presenters and now guide us into the Q&A portion of our meeting. If anybody joined during the presentations, my name is Michelle Carter. I'm an environmental protection specialist with the National Park Service, and I'm serving as the moderator for the meeting this evening. A couple of housekeeping items. We want to make sure that everyone's aware that the meeting's being recorded and that links to this recording and the PowerPoint slides that we shared this evening are going to be posted on each of the agency's AT&P websites and the public comment site once the team has made them compliant with all of our online accessibility requirements. If you have a question you want to submit, please post it into the Google form using the link that's shared in the chat area of your Zoom window. Or you can also scan the QR code that you see here on the slide if you have your phone handy. Now, our meeting this evening, along with this Q&A session, is focused on the draft AT&P for Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. And therefore, we ask that you focus your questions on this particular planning effort. If you want more information on the other AT&Ps, you can visit either the NPS or the FAA websites to learn more about some of the completed plans that Vicki mentioned earlier, or you can also get links to the other draft plans that are currently open for comment. And I think we have again dropped all of the links into the chat, and we again just keep queuing that because if folks have joined in the middle of the meeting, they may not have access to that. One other reminder is that any questions that are submitted through today's meeting will be considered by the agencies as they develop the draft AT&P, but they're not considered formal comments. As mentioned a little bit ago, all of the formal comments must be submitted through the NPS Planning, Environment, and Public Comment site, or the PEPC site, or sent to those mailing addresses that we've mentioned. Again, public comments must be received by June 20th. And at the time, the comment period will end at 8 p.m. Hawaii time, just because the servers that host the database where we're taking comments are based in Denver, and it closes down automatically at midnight Mountain Time. So we just wanted to make sure folks were aware that comments need to be submitted by 8 p.m. on the 20th. As noted at the beginning of the meeting, we'll be here for a total of 90 minutes. We'll adjourn at 7:30 p.m. Hawaii time. And in the event that we get through questions before that end time, we're going to continue to hold the meeting until about 7:30, just to allow for additional questions to come in after you've had a chance to reflect on the presentations, or maybe think through some of the responses maybe that were given to the other questions that were submitted. I also wanted to mention that in the event that there's a delay with questions coming in on our end, it's possible that our team will walk through some of the frequently asked questions that are posted on the project's website, or we might revisit a couple of the questions that we received during the other public meetings that are applicable across planning efforts, just to get more information out there if we're not getting a lot of questions coming in. Okay, so with that, I'll move us over here to our question and answer session. And our first question here, we'll go to Eric with the FAA. So Eric, the question is, what is the National Parks Air Tour Management Act and what does it require?
Thanks, Michelle. So thank you for the question. I know that there are a lot of requirements in the PATMA. And so in general, I would start off like NEPATMA was passed in 2000, and it governs air tours, only commercial air tours over all national parks except for Grand Canyon National Park, which is governed by separate legislation, and parks in Alaska are also not included. NEPATMA requires, as I stated earlier, that the agencies work cooperatively to develop either an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement for each park where commercial air tour operations are occurring or authority is requested by operators. NEPATMA requires the agencies to, as stated earlier as well, publish a draft air tour management plan in the Federal Register and hold a public meeting and provide an opportunity to comment on the proposed air tour management plan and comply with NEPA as well and other substantive laws. So there are a number of things that we are doing in the process of developing this air tour management plan, and hopefully that's helped responsive to the question. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric. Let's see here. Okay. The next question we'll pose to Danielle at the park. Danielle, this question is asking what happens after the public review period on a draft ATMP and draft EA?
Thanks, Michelle, for that question. The agencies will consider comments received on the draft air tour management plan and the draft environmental assessment and continue consultation with the other agencies and Native Hawaiian organizations as necessary, as we have those ongoing. A final air tour management plan and final environmental assessment, documenting the project's outcomes, including comments received and consultations undertaken, will be developed with ultimate approval resting with the FAA and the NPS. I hope that answers that question.
Great, thanks, Danielle. And actually, Danielle, I think it looks like this next question would be appropriate for you too here. This next question is asking, what will an ATMP do for Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park specifically?
Thanks, Michelle. The objective of this air tour management plan under the Act is to develop acceptable and effective measures to mitigate or prevent significant adverse impacts, if any, of commercial air tour operations on the park's natural and cultural landscapes and resources, Native Hawaiian sacred sites and ceremonial areas, wilderness character, and visitor experience inside the ATMP planning area. Hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks, Danielle. It sure does. I just was a little slow here with my coming on and off. Okay, so this next question here, we'll go over to Vicki with the National Park Service. Vicki, this question is asking, why are some parks with air tours not required to have ATMPs or voluntary agreements?
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Yes, we have parks that have 50 or fewer commercial air tours, and under NEPATMA, those are not subject to the requirement to prepare an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement. Currently, we have about 54 parks that fall into that fewer than 50 air tours category, and so they are exempt from that requirement. That number does change slightly from year to year, depending on how many tours are reported by operators. And the Act does allow NPS to withdraw the exemption if the director determines that
a plan or an agreement is necessary to protect the park resources. And then we would prepare an air tour management plan or voluntary agreement. And the NPS has withdrawn the exemption for several parks already. And now those were Death Valley, Mount Rainier, and both of those have air tour management plans that were completed last year. Muir Woods, which was included in the air tour management plan for the San Francisco Bay Area parks, and also Canyon de Chelly, which we are currently working on an air tour management plan for. And hopefully that answers the question. I just wanted to add, as Eric mentioned earlier, national parks in Alaska are exempted from the act, and then the air tours over Grand Canyon are subject to separate legislation. So thank you.
Great, thanks, Vicki. Okay, next question. Go over to Eric with FAA. Eric, the question is asking, what kind of monitoring will be done to ensure impacts are as described? And they're asking, can the public report violations of the ATMP?
All right, thanks, Michelle. Thanks for the question. So the ATMP, I believe section 4, that deals with compliance. And in the air tour management plan, operators are required to equip all the aircraft used for commercial air tours with a flight monitoring technology, and to use that flight monitoring technology during all commercial air tours under this ATMP. They have to also report that data as an attachment to the statutorily required semi-annual reports. And then both agencies are responsible for the monitoring and oversight of this air tour management plan. And if Park Service or FAA or even members of the public believe there are instances of non-compliance, in particular, the Park Service will report that to those allegations to the FSDO. In this instance, I believe the Honolulu FSDO has geographic oversight of the park, and the members of the public may also report allegations of non-compliance to the FSDO, and the FSDO, the Flight Standards District Office, will investigate and respond to all written reports consistent with applicable FAA guidance. And NPS will address any issues related to commercial tour use fees. The Park Service will conduct monitoring to ensure that the terms and conditions of the air tour management plan remain consistent with the park management objectives. Thanks.
Okay, Eric, we'll have you stay on camera here for this next question also. And this next question is asking, have the agencies considered the economic effects of the ATMP?
Thanks. Yeah, so again, I think in the environmental assessment, the draft environmental assessment that the agencies have prepared in support of the draft ATMP, there is a section, I believe it's section 3.7, that analyzes the socioeconomic conditions that may be affected by implementation of any of the air tour management plan alternatives. Air tour operations generate income for operators as well as other ancillary visitor industry businesses, and visitors from outside the immediate area contribute to the local economic activity. And because the number of air tours authorized under the ATMP would be fewer than the average number of flights per year from the last 3 years that the agencies are using, the ATMP could limit potential future economic growth for commercial air tour operations and other ancillary businesses. I mean, although the air tour management plan would limit the opportunities for air tour operators and some of their ancillary businesses to generate revenue from commercial air tours being conducted within the air tour management plan planning area, it would not preclude the operators from making up this revenue in other ways, potentially such as using aircraft for other business ventures or conducting air tours elsewhere within the region. And again, they if they can fly outside of the jurisdictional boundaries as well. So, but what I will say is that any comments in regards to that, please, we welcome comments. Please submit them into Pepsi. Appreciate the question, and hopefully that was responsive. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you, Eric. Great, we got quite a few questions, it seems like, coming in. So we appreciate all of the active participation. Okay, so this next question will go to Vicky. Vicky, this question is asking, would the visitor experience for someone with disabilities be impacted by the air tour plan?
Okay, thanks for that question, Michelle. Air tours are only one of many ways for a person with disabilities to experience a national park. Hawaiʻi Volcanoes has a variety of accessible opportunities, including the visitor center, some trails, and many overlooks and viewpoints that are accessible. If an air tour management plan does reduce or eliminate air tours, so a person can still experience the park. In this case, they would still be able to experience Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park. And overall, the National Park Service works to ensure that people with disabilities can participate in the same programs, activities, and also employment opportunities available to those without disabilities in the most integrated setting possible. And so alternative means of accessing those facilities, programs, and services are provided when a direct accessible experience cannot be provided. And so all these solutions are developed in consultation with the disability community and various partners, including NPS concessioners and commercial service operators. And the NPS has a team dedicated to breaking these kind of physical and programmatic barriers to make parks more inclusive for people with different types of disabilities, such as sensory, physical, or cognitive. And so this team includes 29 coordinators who are working with National Park Service staff. And so they make sure they have the tools and training necessary to provide accessible and inclusive outdoor recreation experiences and interpretive opportunities for park visitors. So thanks for that question, and hopefully that provides more information about that issue.
Thanks, Vicky. Okay, so next question, back to the park. We'll go over to Danielle. The question is asking, excuse me, just a second. Excuse me. The question is asking, would reducing air tours over the park increase the number of vehicles inside the park?
Thanks. That's a good question, Michelle. While the draft ATMP limits the number of air tours conducted within the ATMP planning area to 1,565 flights per year, operators might still offer air tours outside the ATMP planning area, as these would not be regulated by the ATMP, and some known points of interest could still be visible from tours conducted outside of the ATMP planning area. So the reduction in the number of tours per year would not necessarily equate to an increase in traffic or park visitation. We know from talking to visitors that many people that take air tours are already visiting the park in a vehicle. Additionally, the number of people that currently take air tours over the park is relatively small in comparison to those that visit the park on the ground. In 2017, an estimated 82,600 people took commercial air tours of the park over the park, which equates to approximately 4% of the over 2 million visitors that same year. The estimated 82,600 people who took commercial air tours of the park in 2017 is based on reported air tours in 2017, which was 16,520 flights reported that year, multiplied by an estimated 5 passenger seats per aircraft, and the number of air tour customers. Like that number of air tours customers likely overestimates the actual number, since it assumes every passenger seat is occupied. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Danielle. Okay. This next question will go over to Eric. Eric, this question is asking, will ATMPs be extended to other national parks, such as Pearl Harbor Memorial, where current helicopter traffic causes severe noise pollution for the military community that's located on Ford Island, the community living on, and I apologize, HALAWA. My apologies for the lack of pronunciation there on my part. But most importantly, considerations related to disrupting the solemnness of the Pearl Harbor Memorial.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the question. So there are a couple of factors that to consider under NEPATMA in regards to whether or not a park falls under its jurisdiction. And so, you know, the act requires the agencies to develop either an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement for parks where commercial air tour operators have applied for operating authority to actually conduct air tours over that park. And in 2012, Congress amended NEPATMA and included an exemption that from the requirement to, you know, provide an air tour management plan or voluntary agreement for parks where there were 50 or fewer commercial air tour operations. So that's another factor to consider, whether or not the agencies need to, if there are additional parks that the agencies need to bring into compliance with NEPATMA. And one thing that also we have to take into consideration and is an exception in the act is that operations, there's an exception for the altitude for takeoff and landing that are necessary for the safe operation of an aircraft as determined under the rules and regulations of FAA. So it's a long way of saying right now at this point, the agencies are not preparing an ATMP or a VA for Pearl Harbor Memorial. We're not aware that it falls within the jurisdiction at this point in time, but we invite you to submit comments in Pepsi, and that way, if there's anything that we're unaware of, that would be helpful to us. So thank you for the question, and hopefully that was responsive.
Great, thanks, Eric. Actually scanning through these next couple of questions, I think actually the next two we'll have you stay on for. So this first question is asking if could drones fall into the definition of an air tour operator?
Oh, yeah, no. The easy answer is no. Drones do not fall into the definition of air tour operation. And but I will note that launching, landing, or operating of a drone, also called an unmanned aircraft, UAS, from or on lands and waters that are administered by the National Park Service within the boundaries of Hawaiʻi Volcanoes National Park is prohibited except as approved in writing by the superintendent. But thank you for the question. That's a good question. You had another one, Michelle?
Yeah, thanks for staying on here. Okay. This is asking, are you considering impacts to neighboring lands and resources, including cultural practices and endangered species, that may result from the ATMP measures? And they note, for example, increased air tour traffic and noise over neighboring properties as operators attempt to get as close to Kilauea as possible?
Oh, yeah, thanks. Really good question. So the draft environmental assessment analyzes what we call indirect effects of the draft air tour management plan. And those indirect effects include effects to, neighboring properties neighboring the park. The indirect effect analysis considers potential shifts in air tour operations resulting from the implementation of each alternative in the draft EA, and the potential for there to be what we call displacement of air tour operations outside of the air tour management plan planning area due to a reduction in the number of authorized flights per year that are going to be allowed compared to the existing conditions. So yes, we are taking those impacts into consideration, not only in the EA, but I think also we took those into consideration in the 106 consultation process. So thank you for the question. Thanks, Michelle.
Okay, great, thanks. Great, we're about 20, a little over 20-ish minutes left. It looks like we still do have some questions coming in on our end. So thanks to everybody that's hanging on out there, and thank you for continuing to submit your questions. This next question, I'll go ahead and give Eric a break on. I'll go ahead and take this one here. So this question is asking about Section 7 consultation, and it's asking, under the Section 7 consultation process, are you considering impacts to endangered species outside of the ATMP area that are likely to result from the ATMP measures? So yeah, that's a good question. I did talk about Section 7 a little bit earlier, but also wanted to know the EA analyzes the indirect effects of the draft ATMP, and that includes effects to neighboring properties. And that analysis was also included in the Section 7 consultation process. So the indirect analysis considers potential shifts in the air tour operations resulting from implementation of each of the alternative, and also for the displacement of air tours outside of the ATMP planning area due to a reduction of the number of authorized flights per year compared to the existing conditions. So hopefully that was helpful and responsive to the question. I am going through here really quick to see what other questions we have on our end. It looks like we have another question here that we can shoot over to Vicki. Vicki, they're asking, how is noise assessed in the draft ATMP?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. That's a very important part of the impact assessment in the environmental assessment. So what we did is we conduct noise modeling using a model called AEDT, and I can't remember all the full name of the model right now, but that is a model that takes the aircraft noise emission input it inputs the route information from this draft ATMP, altitude, type of aircraft, as I mentioned, speed of the aircraft, and depending on the type of noise metric that's being computed, it either determines like the absolute sound level from that aircraft noise, or it incorporates the background ambient to determine the audibility of the aircraft. So there's a noise technical report that's part of the draft EA. And there's also in section 3.1 of the draft EA that includes that and the results of that analysis and how that affects the park in different locations and for different resources, like to wildlife, to the soundscapes, to visitor experience, or to wilderness character. So yeah, that's don't have a lot of time to go into more detail than that tonight, but thank you for that question.
Okay, sorry, it's a little slow again. A mute button seems to be sticking. Okay, it looks like the next question goes to Vicky again. And the question is asking, how do you get a national park considered for a possible ATMP review if it's not on the list?
Okay, yeah, I was thinking about how that might be answered. And so I'm going to mention a couple things that are required under NEPATMA. So in order for a park to need an air tour management plan, it has to be a park where an operator applied for interim operating authority. And so currently we have about, I think, 70 parks where operators applied for IOA and were granted it. And of those parks, however, as we mentioned earlier, there is a provision in the NEPATMA that exempts parks with fewer than 50 reported air tours, not just 50 IOA, but fewer than 50 reported air tours. They don't need an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement because they automatically qualify for that exemption. If the NPS director determines that the park needs an air tour management plan or a voluntary agreement to protect the park resources and values or the visitor use and enjoyment, that exemption can be withdrawn. And at that point, we would prepare an ATMP or an EA. And it's like we mentioned earlier, that's happened with about 4 parks already. And I think just going forward, as we get these 23 parks done, if we see changes in conditions at a park that's already exempt, the Park Service could decide to withdraw the exemption. But that is the overall process for how that works. So I hope that answers the question, and thank you for it, though.
Hey, Vicky, thanks. Okay, this next question is going over to Eric with FAA. Eric, sorry, I'm just rereading to make sure that I understood it correctly. It looks like there's a question about how the public may be able to say no to this plan.
Oh, okay. Thanks, Michelle. Good question. The answer is that you can say no by submitting your comments into Pepsi. The agencies encourage you to submit your comments and request for changes on the draft plan into NPS Pepsi site. The draft ATMP draft ATMP also includes a right of appeal in which any party having a substantial interest in this order may seek judicial review of the record of decision that will ultimately come out for this ATMP by filing a petition for review in the appropriate U.S. Court of Appeals no later than 60 days after the final order is issued. So thank you for the question.
Great. Okay, Eric, this is maybe going to be a time that you're going to want to keep your water handy again. We have a couple questions that we're going to pass over to you. So this first question is asking, where do authorized air tour operators originate their tours? The Hilo International Airport, Kona International Airport, or other areas?
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks for the question. I think all of the above. So air tours originate from Hilo International Airport, as well as Kona International Airport, and other heliports and airports across the region. So hopefully that answers it. There's majorly the airports, but there are some other heliports and airports across the region that also some of the tours originate from.
Okay, thanks. And then this next question asks, how would the reduction of proposed annual flights, approximately 1,500, be distributed amongst the current 10 authorized air tour operators who currently hold about 26,000 flights annually? Will the number of authorized air tour operators decrease, and how would they be selected?
All right, so that's a good question, and thank you for that question. And the answer is definitely in the air tour management plan. So initially, commercial air tour operators would be allocated a certain number of commercial air tours over the park. And this is referred to, we call it the initial allocation. And it'll be kind of pro rata based on what they're flying now. And that will be the case until a competitive bidding process can be conducted. And in Appendix A of the Air Tour Management Plan, it kind of spells out and lists the initial annual allocations for each operator. And I have that information here. So the initial allocation for Big Island Air Inc. would be under the draft proposed ATMP 5 operations annually for Hawaii Helicopters, 12 Helicopter Consultants of Maui initially would be 1,176. Mukulele flight would be 1. KNS Helicopters would get an initial allocation of 77. KNS also Paradise Safari would get an initial allocation of 185 annual air tours, and Sunshine Helicopter, it looks like, would get an allocation of 109. And again, as I said, it's a proportional number based on existing aircraft operations from the 3-year average. So hopefully that was helpful and answered the question. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Eric. Okay. So we have a question here. It's asking, how do you make a comment on the Pepsi site where your park in question is not listed in a search of documents and projects? So right now, the only ATMPs that are open for public comment are Hawaiʻi Volcanoes, Haleakala, Mount Rushmore, and Badlands. So those are the only 4 that are open for comment. So if you did a search in Pepsi right now, only those 4 would show up. But as I mentioned earlier, if you had questions about some of the other ATMP planning efforts, you can go to either the NPS or the FAA ATMP sites, and you'll find links there to some of the completed plans if that's what you're looking for. Hopefully that answers that question. All right, got about 10 more minutes. It looks like we might have a couple more questions here that have come in. Okay. Eric, this question will go over to you. It's asking, how will the park be monitored for flights? How will illegal airplanes or activities be seen? This is a multi-part. Also, will this monitoring be carried out by the NPS law enforcement? And really exactly how will the air tours be monitored? How will they be reported? And what are the consequences for violations?
All right, thanks, Michelle. Monitored, reported, and consequences. Okay, so section 4 of the draft air tour management plan is the section that covers kind of compliance. And the FAA and the National Park Service are both responsible for monitoring and oversight of this air tour management plan. Specifically under the air tour management plan, operators are required to equip all of the aircraft for which they use conduct commercial air tour operations with flight monitoring technology. And they are also required to use that flight monitoring technology when they're conducting commercial air tour operations under the draft ATMP. And then that flight monitoring data is has to be included as an attachment to the operators' semi-annual reports that they submit to the agencies. So the flight monitoring technology kind of answered, I think the first part. And then in regards to the second part about allegations of illegal airplane activities, in those instances of allegations of non-compliance, those should be reported to the FAA's Flight Standards Division district office, with geographic oversight of the park. And again, I believe that's the Honolulu FSDO in this instance. And then they will, investigate and respond to all written reports consistent with FAA guidance on compliance matters. The Park Service will address any issues related to, park fees and user fees for the park. And they will also focus on the aspect of monitoring to ensure that the terms and conditions of the ATMP are continue to be consistent with the park management objectives. So I think I covered all 3. Potential consequences, I think, if allegations are substantiated, is that the the authorizations to conduct commercial air tours could be, reduced or taken in whole, or other things potentially. But there would be that potential consequence for violations. So hopefully that's answered that question, Michelle.
Okay, thanks. So Eric, and we'll go ahead and have you take this next one too. It's asking how many aircraft do the 10 operators conduct? How many aircraft do the 10 operators conduct air tours in? And how many of those aircraft, or what percentage, are quiet technology?
All right. So how many aircraft? I don't have the answer offhand. I know that the air tour management plan kind of spells out not only the initial allocations, but the aircraft, the fleet mix of the operators that they use for commercial air tour operations. So I would say that information should be in the draft ATMP. I think generally, the aircraft that are currently in use at the park include AS 350s and EC 130s, some Bell helicopter models, and fixed wing. So there's a mix of fixed wing and rotocopter. However, the vast majority of air tours are conducted using helicopters. But again, I would refer the public people to Appendix A of the draft ATMP. I think that would provide the answer to the question better than I can in recollection.
Okay. Great. Let's see what we have here. It looks like we're getting a couple of questions about aircraft operations that are like outside of the scope of what we have the ability to address through this ATMP planning process. And so for those questions, I'm sorry, a lot of those we don't have an answer for you tonight because they're outside of the scope of this. But if there are impacts that are a result, indirect impacts that you feel like are not included in the NEPA analysis as you conduct your review of the EA and feel like the agencies have overlooked something in that analysis, please submit those comments in Pepsi so that we can make sure as we continue developing the ATMP that those additional potential indirect impacts are included. Okay. I think we actually, I just looked at the clock and we're at the end of our time, and Superintendent Lowe was interested in giving a couple of like closing remarks before we wrap up here. So I do want to say thank you so much for participating and thank you for all of these questions. Here in a minute, I'll give more information about next steps. But with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Superintendent Lowe.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you to the presenters. I know it's late for some of you on the mainland. It's probably close to midnight. Just some closing. This has been a long process. It's been over 20 years where we've been working on developing the air tour management plan. I think we're at a point where probably gotten the furthest in developing an air tour management plan. We're able to share that with you at this meeting, and your input is valuable. So I want to really thank you for sticking with us through the process. I know some of you have been with us for the full 20 plus years, and I encourage you to stay engaged. We value your input, so mahalo nui loa. And I'll pass it back to you, Michelle.
Thank you. Okay, so as we wrap up tonight, I do want to mention for anybody who may have joined in the middle of the meeting that there's a frequently asked questions document that's going to be posted with the draft ATMP and EA on the Parks public comment website. Also, this meeting was recorded, and once we've had a chance to apply the closed captions, we'll post it so that you can view the recording visiting the links that are either on the NPS or FAA websites or the Park Pepsi site. And I believe those links are being dropped in the chat if they haven't already. A reminder for all attendees that all formal comments that you want the agencies to consider Either should be submitted via the Pepsi site, you see the link on the screen, or to the mailing address that's listed on the park's Pepsi site. Again, the deadline is June 20th at 8 p.m. Hawaii time. And thanks again for your participation. We appreciate you and your time. And on behalf of both the FAA and the NPS, we look forward to hearing from you. Have a great rest of your evening. Take care. Bye.